Hello, I'm Francisco and welcome to Fun with Stamps. We will now dive into the fascinating, exciting, overwhelming world of philately, the study of stamps and postal history, otherwise known as collecting stamps. In this episode of Fun with Stamps, we will look at two very special stamps from the United States and the Soviet Union, the American Woman stamp and the Soviet Woman stamp. We will interpret them as images and figure out what they can tell us about their historical context. First, the American Woman stamp. We can see this stamp is rectangular and printed in deep violet. At the top it says the American Woman, and at the bottom it says US postage with its price, which is 4 cents. At the very center, the main image is of an adult white woman with a young girl, also clearly white, both behind an open book. On both sides of this central image we can see smaller images. On the left side there is a courthouse and a judge's hammer with the phrase Civic Affairs, and below it a diploma, a notebook, and some books with the word education. On the right side we can see the symbol for medicine, a violin, theater masks, and lab equipment with the phrase arts and industry. This stamp was printed in 1960 as a commemorative stamp at a time when the Cold War was in full swing because the Soviet Union had recently matched the United States' capability to make nuclear weapons. It was also a time of intense debate about the role of American women in American society, because on one hand they already had the right to vote and work, but they were also expected to follow restrictive gender roles that sometimes forced them to be housewives and mothers. A huge question at the time was how women were actually expected to participate in American capitalist society. Were they expected to work and compete and be productive just like men? Yeah, a lot of the time. But were they also expected to just stay home with the children? Also yes, most of the time. We could say that this stamp is attempting to show a general view of the role of women in American society. On one hand, the book and the little girl at the center seem to show them as mothers and educators. But it also includes their participation in civic affairs, education as actual work outside of child rearing, and to an extent, arts and industry. It doesn't seem to connect women to any specific jobs, but it does seem to give a general overview of how diverse women's contribution to society can be. At the time, this may not have been the intention, but nowadays we can notice that the woman at the center is very clearly white, and she's wearing her hair in the very specific hairstyle of the First Lady at the time, Mamie Eisenhower, as well as the next First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy. You know, that poofy 60s hairstyle that required drying and hairspray and usually going to a salon. So clearly this woman is not supposed to look poor or struggling or like some kind of rule breaker. This is what a respectable American woman was expected to look like in 1960. Interestingly, these are elements we may also see in the Soviet Woman stamp. For the elements of the Soviet Woman stamp, we can see that it's also rectangular, but it's printed in 3 colors: gold, black, and red. At the top, in Russian, it says, Soviet woman is an active builder of communism. And at the bottom it shows the price, 4 kopecks, which was also like 4 cents to the Soviet currency, the ruble. At the bottom it also says Russia and CCCP, which were the initials of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in Russian, and it also shows the year it was printed, 1962. Its main image is of a white woman's face, and behind her we see 4 smaller images without text. On the left side we see a factory with a chimney and an oil tank, and below it a classroom with an adult at the front. On the right side we see an individual working with lab equipment, and below it a modern tractor. Again, this is a commemorative stamp that was printed at the height of the Cold War in 1962, actually a few months before the Cuban Missile Crisis put the Soviet Union and the United States face to face. A similar debate to the one about the role of American women in society was happening in the Soviet Union for Soviet women, but with somewhat different implications. Mainly, there was the assumption that socialism itself was already making men and women equal in the Soviet Union, because they were already required to have the same jobs. This allowed Soviets to openly criticize the oppression of American women under capitalism, because Soviet women could literally be seen working alongside Soviet men in almost every single job. But this equality was not real for a lot of Soviet women who were still forced to take care of their houses and their children without any help from the men in their lives. And not only that, the Soviet system did not have any mechanisms for people to show disagreement or dissent. So women's viewpoints on this were seen as going against socialism and were therefore constantly silenced. It looks like the Soviet government issued this commemorative stamp as a clear visual answer to the American woman stamp, but kind of making the point that Soviet women were actually treated as equals under socialism. The jobs represented in this stamp are more specific and very clearly important for any country. 3 of them are either scientific or industrial, which means they would traditionally be associated with men, and the other one, education, is actually shown as another job, not something that women are expected to do for free at home. Similarly, it may not have been the intention at the time, but the woman at the center is clearly white and shown as not overly made up. The figure of the First Lady didn't exist in the Soviet Union because there was the assumption that under socialism, the president's wife would have a job and things to do just like her husband and just like any other man. Therefore, the wives of Soviet premiers like Nina Khrushcheva and Victoria Brezhneva had no time for elaborate hairstyles and generally wore their hair short and down. Unlike in the United States, a respectable Soviet woman was a worker. Plain and simple. Did you have fun with stamps? I hope you learned something. See you next time.